So I heard you like comics. Perhaps one of the most widely debated questions when understanding comics is the question, well, what are they? And as the scholarship is still relatively new and there are many proposed positions, there are no real distinct answers. But I like to say many close understandings. And it's these close understandings that we will be discussing today. Now, the ideas of comics that we will be talking about is from a Western perspective, which is incredibly limiting. However, it's a place to start, and many ideas are still applicable to other forms of comics, graphic novels, mangas, manhwas, webtoons, you name it, which I will be discussing more specifically in the future. Now, what are comics? One of the early proposed positions on what makes a comic was by Will Eisner, an American cartoonist and writer who defined comics as sequential art. Basically, the idea is that we follow the sequence of comics, and it is the sequences of images together that make up the comic. Now, these ideas were taken further by comic artist and researcher Scott McCloud in 1993 in his pivotal works, Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art, by suggesting that comics are not just sequential art, but juxtaposed art. Specifically, he said, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. And he explained his position quite aptly through films by drawing a comparison with time. That animation is sequence as time, whereas comics are sequence spatially juxtaposed to each other. Basically, space does for comics that time does for film. However, on the question of what are comics, different scholars have different positions. Other prominent positions in this debate come from historian R.C. Harvey, who suggests that comics are a relationship between image and text to achieve a narrative end, with a particular importance placed on the speech balloon. And this verbal-visual blending that he says makes comics a hybrid form of two separate medias. This idea of hybrid form is one that is not supported by McCloud and others who see comics as its own entity. However, when considering the idea of hybrid or the hybrid nature of comics, it's a good idea to look at The Art of Comics, a philosophical approach by Aaron Meskin, Roy Cook, and Warren Ellis. And they suggest that comics take things from all other art forms and sew them together. Comics comprise illustration and prose and theater and sloganeering and graphic designing and any other dang thing you wish to sling into the pot. And that is really what makes the art form of comics. And so I would like to take that a little bit further by recognizing that the many aspects of comics and how they move and interact together actually don't make it a hybrid necessarily, but make it its own genre. And the best way to explain it is by looking at films. Films take so many different elements from different spaces, whether we're looking at the orchestration, whether we're looking at sound design, whether we're looking at color theory, whether we're looking at cinematography. And it takes all those elements and makes it its own genre, the film. And the same thing can be said for comics. Now, other elements that researchers have discussed are in regards to the nature of comics. Charles Hatfield, a professor of English at California State University, discusses these ideas by suggesting that one of the defining features of comics is the tension between text and image on the page. Another work titled Black Images in the Comics, A Visual History by Frederick Stromberg suggests, comics are a medium of extremes. They often simplify and stereotype their subjects, partly in an attempt to make our complex world understandable, partly as a means of efficient short-form communication. In the process, of course, they also highlight their surrounding society's trends and attitudes, making them easily available for observation and study. This is a really interesting idea, but I think that if we look further and we look at manhwas, webtoons, and other forms of comics, you see this idea of simplification doesn't exist in all forms. And so I think that this creates an interesting tension, and which requires us to look more closely at other forms of comics. So, back to the question, what is a comic? The truth is that it's incredibly complicated, and positions such as McCloud's argument, as discussed in The Art of Comics, remains enduring because of its sophisticated analysis. But also, critiques of its position, particularly when considering single-panel images or works that are not sequential in traditional ways, also hold. Therefore, a working understanding of comics that brings the different ideas that have been discussed in this video can be: comics can be juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and to produce an aesthetic response in a viewer with a narrative function. The can be is a very important part that I put here because it suggests that all the elements we've discussed by scholars thus far can be applicable. And it gives us room to allow for new analyses in the future and strengthen or even change the working definitions that we have. Again, it's really important to remember that these definitions come from a Western perspective, and that taking a look at mangas, manhwas, and webtoons can really change how the comic has thus far been described. And I will make videos on that in the future. Okay, bye!